Well, thanks for joining us today, and good to be here with Leigh-Anne Tucker and myself as we expand and expound on the conversation that was begun on Sunday. We've entitled a sermon series called Baggage, and we want to look at those things that will help us to travel lightly. And I was talking to somebody, they were saying that there's a difference between baggage and luggage. Luggage are the things that you take with you on a vacation that are necessary to make your vacation great. Baggage are those things that just kind of weigh you down. So we're talking about depression, we're talking about mental health, we're talking about addictions and habits and those things that just kind of drag you down. And if there's anything that we've discovered during COVID is that there's a whole lot that has weighed us down. So we want to talk about how we can get free with some of those things. And we began this discussion talking really about depression, and that's just a huge conversation. We're not going to be able to cover all of it today, but Leigh-Anne Tucker has joined us not only as our family ministry pastors in the past year, but she's also a registered psychotherapist. So this is kind of her field. So what we thought we would do is we'll let her interview some of the pastors, and she can talk to us about some of our personal experiences, and we'll give you a glimpse into our lives a little bit later on. So Leigh-Anne, go ahead, interview me.
All right, so I'm excited. So I thought my first couple of questions to Pastor Rick is, you've been a pastor for as long as I've known you. So,
Thank you for making me feel old.
But that being said, so what do you think people are thinking about depression? What are some common thoughts you've had, or people have asked you about depression or your life experience?
Sure. I think one of the biggest questions that come with depression within the church, of course, is we have done, I think, in Canadian culture, a good job at working towards removing the stigma. But I don't think the Canadian church has done a good job at removing the stigma. And so there's this tension line between I'm supposed to live in victory. Jesus is supposed to set me free. I'm supposed to be healed. I'm supposed to walk free of all of that which weighs me down. And yet the reality is that is not always the case. And I'm supposed to get free, but I don't know how to get free. And then we fake it till we make it. And I think that once we figure out that faking it doesn't work, it's just kind of a mask, it drives us quieter. It drives us into a closet and we go, well, I just can't talk about it because I'm not as free as I really would like to be. So I just pretend to be free. And I think that's really when it comes down to mental health and depression. I think there's a lot of people that are just pretending to be free, but inside they're having a hard time. And I think COVID has brought that out.
Yeah, I would agree. So we know that the stats of mental health, it doesn't take, you turn on the news and it's always, mental health has increased. It's always do we choose physical body health or do we choose our mental health, right? That's been in our news every day for the last, year almost, right? Since we've been dealing with this COVID, the effects on children's mental health and things. I think that tension doesn't just lie in the church, but in society in general. And I think it's great to start that conversation. So as a practitioner of mental health, I would always look, where does depression come from? Is it biological? Is
right.
it,
right.
I always get questions of is it just in my head, or is it in my body, or is it situational, or is it caused by an experience, or
is it hereditary?
Or is it by my parents? Do I inherited certain patterns or genes? And I think it is a complex question. So I thought if it was okay with you,
sure.
we talk a little bit about that before you share your experiences with depression and what you've seen in the church and how the church can be better. So I thought we would start with, what is depression? I feel like at times as a practitioner, someone would come in and go, hey, I have depression. And I go, so what is that? And they're like,
yeah.
I don't know.
How does that translate in your life?
Exactly. That's always, so my follow-up question is, what does depression look like for you? And they're like, what do you mean? Isn't it just that I'm sad? And so it's really diving into those things. And sometimes you go to a doctor, and again, this is not a disrespect to the medical world, but there's such an overwhelming sense of this, that there's this stigma that if I go to the doctor, I'm going to get a pill. Mm-hmm. That it's purely biological. There's something wrong with the chemicals in my mind. And so I'm going to get a pill. I don't want a pill. Mm-hmm. And so we've rendered depression to just this one concentrated area. There's something wrong with my head. Yeah, exactly.
That's not true.
That's not true though. So we do know, like science has said, there are some that are very biological, right? So especially for women, we want to be honest about this topic. When you have a baby and there's lots of hormones, we know of postpartum, and it can be actually very dangerous for women because in the first like 48 hours, we know of like psychosis that can come in. And so that's why doctors and midwives are always checking in on like, especially like the next day, right?
New
A
moms.
midwife comes
Yeah.
or moms come and go, hey, how's it going? Because we've learned actually a lot about that topic. Also, we know that when young girls hit puberty, there's a lot of chemical imbalances. Their bodies are still working that out.
Right.
And often that's another season of life that can be biological.
We're also seeing that in young boys.
We are actually, yeah.
In fact, there's an real. Some of my reading is there's a real increase of probability of mental health issues in that 17, 18 into the 20 range. That's often the time when there's experimental use with drugs and alcohol.
Yep.
So if there's any predominance towards this, it may be the door opening to something that might not have been opened to. And so
Exactly.
we're seeing that even within our teenagers.
Exactly.
I think another issue, and again, we're not going to deal with all of these today. We're just bringing them up that they are realities. A lot of times you hear talk about bipolar.
Yes.
Explain bipolar.
Okay, so before I explain bipolar, I would say we have to actually go one step back and just talk about major depressive disorder. And in my language, it's going to be MDD. I will try not to do acronyms because that's going to confuse everyone, including in my field. So all depression is, let's go back, it is an episode of sadness that's over a month, that you lose interest, that you don't really want to go to work, you don't really want to do what's required of life is kind of what people come to, right? So it's an episode. It's not a life journey. It's not a state of
interesting.
sadness necessarily. It's like, it really comes down to motivation. So when we talk about general sadness, maybe situational. So if you have a loss of work or employment or you lose someone, general sadness is actually really good. So like we get concerned when sadness doesn't go away in a year as so that's like really interesting, right? So if you think about if you lost a family member, we would actually expect that you would go through the grief process for a year. We would, or like a divorce or a major life loss. It doesn't have to just be marriage.
So sadness isn't always the enemy.
No, sadness is actually really good for us. It brings and it calls attention to things that we actually need to focus on, right? So any kind of loss. So it could be a circle of life loss. It could be employment loss. It could be a friend moved away. It could be life changes. Like there are losses that are situational that totally make sense for the sadness that people are having. And people jump to, oh, I'm depressed because I'm sad. And that's actually not the case. So that's really good to clarify in a conversation like that.
That's actually very, very helpful because especially during this COVID process, there have been a few days, not a lot, but there have been a few days, both Cheryl and I have experienced some sadness, some distress, we wake up in the morning and it's like the morning runs into the afternoon, runs into the evening, and it like nothing is helping. Not even a good steak or the barbecue. And we, one of us will go on what we call a COVID walk.
Yes,
and we
exactly.
I have got to get away, and we go on a walk, and there's been a few times where it's like one of us will go for a walk, Cheryl will go for a walk, and it'll be like, okay, it's been 2.5 hours. Is she coming home? Did she get lost?
Right.
Do I have to go look for her? But she was like, I was just so sad. I just needed to walk it off.
Yes.
So that's so helpful that you can actually go through a few days of this and not go, there's not anything wrong with me. It's actually healing and helping and soothing for me.
Yeah, because if we ignore sadness, that leads to other things, right? So I would say I would expect that mental health would be on a rise because we, as a society, we don't really deal with sadness really well, and we don't actually accept sadness as a viable, okay emotion. Like we tend to label sadness as bad, and we in the field try to not actually do that to sadness because I always think of like that movie with the emotions and like it's a kid's movie, right? But it's sadness is actually great. What it does is it rallies people around you. It makes sure that if you are in a great community that you're not alone. Sadness does actually a lot of things for us. It makes us actually, when we are happy, it allows us to be happy, which is like super key But to answer your question about bipolar, what happens with that, because like that was a question.
Right,
So
right.
what happens is that we have an episode of depression, which is not just sadness, right? We're losing motivations. We're not eating right. We're not sleeping right. We're getting triggered by things that are the unknown, like kind of like we talked about on Sunday. But then what it all bipolar is, if you think about it as like a heart monitor, it goes beep, 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 beep,
Right,
beep.
right.
So in this idea is depressive episodes are only down, okay? And it doesn't have to be super down. It could be like slightly down. So it kind of depends on what's going on in that person's life. It doesn't have to be they hit rock bottom. Oftentimes we're like, oh, this is the image that I get. Or of when I think about, it doesn't have to be that way.
Right.
It could just be something that's unexpected,
Right.
right? And so all bipolar is the opposite of that. So when you can't handle really good emotions and your body and your brain don't actually align, and that's where manic comes from, right? So often,
So the manic episode is when it's up.
Yeah,
And
very, very high.
You can't control the highs.
Yes. So most of the time, people kind of do like a mid-range, and we call it that, like the window of tolerance. Is like we do have highs and we have lows naturally, right?
Right.
And depression would be like hitting the lowest low, and manic or the high, it would be like the high of highs, and then you can't control it. Like you start like, so if depression is no ambition, this would be like you would feel like you're on ecstasy, like the best
Right.
happiness for no reason, and that's why
Right.
people often choose and do things that just start to not make sense.
When it's like it's out of character.
Right.
Yeah.
And often people who have bipolar, it can come from parents who have maybe like major psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. There's some research to say that like if you have schizophrenia and you have a child, that child is more likely to have bipolar because of those, because the just because it's biology, but not necessarily. Like it's not like you're
No.
condemning your child. I don't want people to think like
But
that
I think
either,
I think there's some health to that point of view, though. When we talk about the origins of depression, that some of it can be biological in the same way that, and this is one of the points that I've been wanting to make in this entire series, you can live victoriously and have diabetes. Mm-hmm. You can live victoriously and have depression. You can have serotonin levels. You can have issues of biological concerning your mind, and that doesn't make you less victorious. But there are also issues that come because of an experience that you've had, a trauma that has occurred that actually needs to be processed, confronted, healed,
Yeah.
and moved forward from.
Yeah.
But there are also those situations where if you have a predisposition towards that because of your parenting, wisdom just says you need to be aware of it.
Yeah.
Any more than if, my father had prostate cancer. So now the doctor's always asking me about some of those things because it's in my family. My mother passed away of cancer. Cancer's in my family. It was my grandmother died of cancer. And so they're always checking me and looking for me that. I'm also glad that they were watching for that
Yes,
because
exactly.
we understand that there are those predispositions. It's okay. And it doesn't mean that you were somehow confessing or that you're somehow disappointing Jesus, or that it's a negative confession to say it runs in my family, and so I have to be sensitive to it. I think that's
Yes.
just wisdom.
Yes, I would totally agree on
That's
that.
a wise Christian. That's not a foolish Christian.
And it's also to keep in mind that, like, when we talk about depression, biological depression is only about 4% of the population. So a lot of it's situational and coping mechanisms. So that speaks to me that Jesus does and can do victory
Right.
in mental health, right? So if it's like very biological, we do have like things like medication, and yes, there's resistance to that, but that's less and less because of like Bell talk and awareness.
Right.
It's also to let Christians know that it's not forever. Like if we already know that it's 4 or 5% that's biological, well, the rest of it, the other 95, is very situational and
Right.
stress driven. So we can actually eliminate that stress through techniques like having good like therapists or like good community here at Gateway or good friendships that are just like,
Yeah.
hey, how are you doing, right? So victory is very possible in terms of like getting over an episode of depression or a long sadness.
Well,
so that's really important to know.
And in the midst of COVID, your idea that sadness is okay, it's for a period of time, is probably one of the best things I've heard for a while, because
Oh,
it's
good.
like, because in COVID we keep thinking if I've had a bad day or a bad 4 days or 5 days, how are you doing? I'm not doing well.
Right.
And so if I'm not doing well, then I either compensate, and I compensate by either things that I should not be compensating with,
Yes.
or I try to exercise myself into better, or I do something to try to fix the sadness rather than going, no, I've been sad for 4 or 5 days. How are you doing? I'm sad.
Yeah.
Are you coping? Well, not as well as I'd like, but it's okay, rather than
Exactly.
saying to somebody else, you know what, I'm falling apart. Well, no, after 30 days or 45 days, you might be
Yes.
falling apart and you may need some direct intervention. But it's okay to be in this season in particular to go, man, it's been a tough month and I'm really, really tired and worn out.
Yeah. So like I would even say like even if you've had a low month, how much loss have you had, right? So if you've lost a major job in this time, or like depending on what COVID has done in this season, each loss could take a while to improve, right? So
Right.
it's not even just don't focus on the amount of days necessarily. It's like, we always ask questions about loss because I think loss and sadness go hand in hand. Does the loss make sense to the sadness, right? And right now, I think that's perfect. Like, I think so Cheryl going on a walk, right? That makes sense to me, right? Because there is things that we are losing on a daily basis. And so does the loss make sense? Yes, I think we need to do a better job at accepting and being aware of that and just kind of going, yeah, I'm okay to not be okay right now.
Right.
The world's not okay right now. So why do I think the imperfection lies within me? Or is it just our broken world in this broken season?
And why are we trying to convince ourselves that Christians aren't supposed to be affected by any of this? That was my situation in my childhood.
Yeah, why don't you share a little bit about that?
Well, and this is going way back. This is going back to the 1970s. And I was a junior high. As far as my memory goes, I was a junior high. My mother always had struggles with depression. And that was a really difficult thing because the church that I grew up in was very small, very Pentecostal charismatic. There was absolutely no way you were having any discussions about that in the 1970s. And she went through a series of physical issues that required her to have a hysterectomy. And back then, they just loaded you up with estrogen, which again, if time were to tell, estrogen does all kinds of things
Yes.
on the human body. And, we've since learned that, there was way too much of that. But there was a period of time when I would come home and my mom would be crying, and she'd been crying all day. She was still in her house coat. She hadn't fixed her hair. And I would say, "What's wrong, Mom?" And she would just look at me and she'd start crying. And I didn't know why she was crying. And my dad would come home. My dad worked a lot. And she was crying around my dad, and it was frustrating for him. And it really got to a point where I actually couldn't live at home anymore. And yet nobody told me why. It was just, your mom's not well. Your mom's not well. And I mean, I'm an only child, but obviously I was more of a handful for her than that could handle. And so I had to go live with my grandparents. And I don't have a memory of how long it was, but I know that it was into months and months where I had to live with my grandparents, and nobody seemed to talk about it. And I think, when I look back in hindsight and even talking to my parents about it, my mother was the adult Sunday school teacher. My dad was the, quote, worship leader in the church. And so there was no way that anybody could admit that there was any kind of an issue, whether it's biological or trauma or whatever it was that she was going through. And so nobody talked about it. And here I am at junior high. My mom's crying all the time. She's sad. I got to live with my grandparents, and I don't know why, other than my mom's sick, and nobody seems to want to talk about it, and I had nobody to talk to. And I reflect now in my late 50s and go, that was a really, really hard time in my life, age 10, 11, 12, in that whole season. And it took my mother years to finally get it all regulated out. And even then, she still battled with it for years to follow. And I look back at it now in my hindsight and go, wow, God was good to me, because I don't know how I would have handled that now. it was just a very, very difficult season in my life. And even to this day, there was, my mother's been passed away for a long time now, but even in her latter years, there was a reluctance to talk about it. There was very little acknowledgement of what was going on in her life. And so I personally have experienced the stigma of the church doesn't talk about it because that means there's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with your walk with God. You're disappointing Jesus. You're not walking in victory. You're not taking thoughts captive.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big challenges. There's a verse of scripture that gets tossed around in the church, and it's 2 Corinthians 10. It says, we demolish arguments and make every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. I actually love the verse, but here's the problem. The church has never taught anybody how to take our thoughts captive. Now, I know that some people are going, well, that's an overview. Our church does a great job at it. Okay, but there's a real ignorance on how I take my thought captive, besides get up in the morning, read my Bible, and listen to worship music.
And pray. I think that's how I was taught to take my thoughts captive, was like, hey, just pray and God will make me a new creation, ? I hope so. Like, I kind of always felt like, I hope I'm you taking every captive
But
thought.
you can pray, you can listen to worship music, you can read your Bible, and you can still not be able to take your thoughts captive.
Yes.
And still find yourself not in a good place.
Yes. So I came up kind of with a list. Well, not me, a much smarter man than me. Dr. Beck, who is CBT, which is, so looking at is a theory, just like you look at your thoughts and you process your thoughts and you like actually slow down your thought process. And a lot of it's writing, so we're not going to ask you to do that unless you want to do that. But I thought today we would actually help people take their thoughts captive. And some of that is like analyzing. We're not going to get into analyzing Rick's thoughts because he's my boss. So let's just keep it friendly.
I don't do well with analyzing. I'm not a big navel gazer.
No. This isn't like there's some of that in therapy, and we want to like actually say, yes, we do some of that, but we're finding more and more that that's actually not helpful for people. So to kind of like say, like we tend to actually do a lot of thought process in therapy. So I kind of made a list. We won't go through all of them because we don't have time, but if you want to Google it, because people have Google everywhere on their phone, so it's just typically like thought distortions. If you Google that, you'll find Dr. Beck's work. It's been around like probably from the 50s or 60s.
Sure.
But the idea is, I think the challenge in the church is vocabulary, and how, like even with your mom, she probably didn't have the words. It's like, I have blue days.
Right. Oh yeah, I heard that a word. Blue days, but what's a blue day?
But what does that mean, right? And so therapy can help you kind of like define those. Like what kind of blue day is it? Is it a blue day with sunshine? Like we're going into imagery a bit.
Right.
But like I think back then we just didn't have vocabulary, right? Like our science, like therapy is quite new. Like if we think biologically, it's new. Our research is very new. People want answers very quickly, but research has taken a lot of time, and a lot of mistakes have been made. Like estrogen, like your mom, like so that's very like I would say that's very complex. Your mom's story, it's like okay, so first it was biologically driven, then she established habits. So now we're going into situation, like, so it's not just like one blanket, like, hey, your mom has this type of depression, right? We can't really define it that way because people are complex. Like if we don't think people are complex, then we're doing them a disservice.
Right.
People are like, and families are really complex, and our societal things are very complex, and so I think people want like this answer, like I have depression, give me medication or give me this answer, and I don't think it's like that because people are super complex. And same with your mom. It was like I sat like when I was listening to you, I'm like, oh, that's biologically driven, and now it's situationally driven. Now there's general sadness because her only son has gone away. How does she deal with the shame of that? How does she show up to church when it's never talked about? And how does she carry on and put that mask on when there's no relief? Like, who does she talk to about that?
When you fake it and you can't talk to anybody about it.
Right? So
what are some of these?
Sorry, I got a little carried away on that one.
But what are some of these distortions?
So I've kind of ranked them. So I think the one that I see the most is all or nothing thinking. So it's black or white, right? So is COVID good or bad, right? Like it's like, oh, it's good this way or it's bad this way, or like that's a bad example, but like generally it's black and white thinking. And when you look at a situation, you see no gray. right? So it's like it's all you see is forest is kind of what you don't see the trees.
Right.
So it's like you don't see the pathway. And so you can get to this point of this is the answer or this is, and that's how people get stuck in their thinking off.
And especially in the church, it's either all good or all bad.
Yes.
It's all Jesus, it's all the devil.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
There's no, some of this is kind of in the middle there, and it's a navigated process.
Yes. And humans, they're not saint or sinner. They're just humans. Like I often use that in like when I talk to Christians, it's like they don't want to be the sinner for sure, but they also know that they can't fully be the saint. And I said, what does it look like to be both? And so like to do that, I think is really helpful for Christians. Like we're called to be a new creation, but we're in process.
Right.
And
right,
that's, I think, really helpful for Christians to know that it's okay to live in the gray. Don't maybe like we want to keep like it's like shades of gray. So like if you started out in like black, like me, I became a Christian. So before then I was kind of living like a black life, and now like in process,
right.
I'm hopefully getting to more white. But like it's trying to get Christians to really realize that it's okay to live in gray,
right.
and we're all there, right? So even just giving acceptance to yourself.
Tell me about fortune telling.
Yeah, so that one is like you're predicting before something happens, right? You're predicting a negative outcome. So let's say we are going to go to a party. That's a great one, right? It's a social event. Well, people won't like me. People won't talk to me. So you're predicting all negative responses potentially.
Yeah.
But you don't know. But you don't know if they're actually going to happen.
I'm going to go to church. I'm not wearing a mask, but people are going to judge me.
Exactly, right?
People don't know or care.
Yeah. Or like before COVID, it's like, I'm going to go to church. I have to wear the right thing, or like people won't, like, it's all those like negative consequences. And so what we would do in therapy, so what happened if you? Right? So to kind of slow that process down, be like, so what would happen if you wore the wrong shirt?
Right. So we would call that glass half empty thinking.
Yeah. Kind of thing,
Okay.
Right?
How about labeling?
Labeling is kind of seeing, this is kind of introspective one. The other ones are more like external ones. This one's really introspective. It's labeling yourself. So like things when people come in the office, they're like, I'm a failure. Or I'm a loser, or like it's like very much how they see themselves.
And it may be because someone else has convinced them of that, or they've convinced themselves of it.
Right. And so we talk a lot about if this is a person's issue, false beliefs. Like how do they come to that realization that they're a failure, even though, and then we create evidences that would talk about like, you have a job, you have responsibilities, you're a mom, and they're like, I wouldn't be a good mom because, and so you're like, okay, so we would flip the question on them. So what is a good mom?
Right.
Or what is a good, whatever they're, like, it's like if sometimes early in ministry, Caleb would catch me on this. He's like, oh, I'm just not a good youth pastor. And he's like, but what's a good youth pastor, right?
Exactly.
He didn't know he was doing therapy on me, and I didn't know at the time. But sometimes we get these like expectations in our jobs or these roles that we can never really live up to. And therefore we go, oh, we're bad. Or, oh, like we take this negative
never
image.
going to.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so that's kind of like labeling. And I find that one really hard because it kind of, some of it, it's like, it comes down to where you find your worth. Right? Because it's like, I'm not worthy of this oftentimes. So people can get caught up in that, right?
Yeah.
So like I think about your mom, I'm not worthy of doing these things, right?
Sure.
Like she's like, I wonder if there would be, sometimes there's shame connected to that. Like, oh, she's supposed to be the Sunday school teacher.
So she's supposed to be something.
Right?
Then.
She's supposed to be something. And like that internal process of like she kept doing it, which is like amazing. Like that's like, to me, victory that she like had these issues, but she kept doing it. Like I see victory as a therapist because she was somehow in her process, and she's still able to do it.
And now after all those years, I just feel bad that she had to go through that all by herself. And nobody knew how to help her.
Yeah.
Tell me about mental filtering.
So that would be kind of like a collapse of mistakes. So once you make one, you're kind of becoming more and more like almost, I don't want to say paranoid because that gives like a different concept in my field, but like you become more aware of a mistake, and then you're like, if I make another one, people are going to notice. Like they're kind of like on edge more. And then of course when you're on edge, you make it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? But you're only filtering mistakes, and you don't hear, like, your boss like could say, "Oh my gosh, you did so good at this podcast," right? Like, but then I in my head would be just like, "Oh, but I messed up on that word, or I didn't go to that right away," and so all I would see is negative things and never hear bad things. Another one, I'm going to jump in, would be overgeneralization. I find that this is often church people. Can I be Can I be honest?
Absolutely.
So it's like and I think it comes out in language like, well, the church just doesn't care. Well, what's the church? Like, who be the church, right? So people come into the office like, well, I thought my church would do more.
Okay.
Ooh, okay, because that's really overgeneralizing. Like, you're like looking at a group of people, or you're looking at a situation, and you're like, it's undefined, right? Like, there's no details.
The
to
church,
it.
the organizational structure, the people on Sunday, like who is it? Who is the church?
Yeah, so I find overgeneralization huge for Christians. Like, they kind of have these expectations but don't know where they come from. And so in therapy, you're like, so we just try to like slow that process down a bit. And it's really because I ask for details at that point.
And even in COVID, the people that think, I thought my friends would.
Yes.
I thought my family would.
Exactly.
Like, no one's reached out to me. And I thought these last few minutes, how do we wrap this up? What can we do for ourselves?
Yeah.
How do I not be a victim? And one of the things that when Paul the Apostle says, you take every thought captive, the impetus behind that is you do something. You do something about it. Mm-hmm. And I think that when it comes to mental health and depression, the more proactive you can be to care for your own mental health, the better chance you have of recovery, because nobody cares about your mental health more than you do next to Jesus.
Yep.
And so if you're having a sad day or a sad week or a blue day or a blue month, if friends and family are letting you down, if things are not going the way you would like, do something about it. Don't sit around waiting and staring at the mirror, feeling bad for yourself or feeling sorry for yourself or feeling disappointed in the people around you that have let you down, that just drives you further into this hole of sadness. Do something about it.
Yeah, I would totally agree. So
reach out to somebody or do something for somebody else.
Yeah. So a lot of people come into the office and they're like, you're going to fix me. Right? They're like, you're going to take this away. And I go, actually, you're going to take it away. And it's like flipping it on its head.
Say that again.
What did I say?
You said people come into your office and they say, fix me.
Oh, yeah.
You take it away. But your response is?
My response is actually, you're going to take it away. Because
I actually don't. Expand on that. That's a good way to land.
Okay, cool. So as a therapist, I'm going to give you techniques, or like sheets to work through, but generally you're going to do the work. So if you're expecting, like, we always think like you go to the gym to exercise your body.
Right.
When you go to a therapist, you're exercising your mind, but we don't exercise your mind. Like, we're not like, if to put like the analogy, like, we're not going to go to the gym with you and lift the weight for you. You're going to have to lift the weight so your body gets the energy, right? So we do that. We are going to show you something in like our session, but then we're going to assign it as homework. And that's why a lot of people like don't like therapy, because most people don't like homework and doing something. And that's why the dropout rate, because they come to therapy looking for like a doctor, right? And we're not doctors. So doctors, you go to a doctor, they're going to give you a diagnosis of
something.
You broke your arm. Here's a cast. Take this pill for pain medication. Whereas therapy's not like that. Our ideas aren't about diagnosis and treatment. Our idea is to get you to practice the skills that you need. So if it's like coping mechanisms, we're going to suggest that.
Well, yeah, it sounds.
And then you have to do that.
It sounds like you're actually going to teach us how to take every thought captive.
Yeah, exactly. That's the
point.
point.
Which is so interesting that when I was having personal conversations with Tina Smith as we were preparing for last week's message, she said to me, I always believe in victory. Yeah. Even when it's biological and requires medication, there is a measure of victory that everybody can have concerning depression and mental illness. The challenge is, are you willing to put in the hard work?
Exactly.
If you're willing to put in the hard work, because even Jesus is not a depression pill. Mm-mm. And he will teach us things through depression. He will teach us things through our sadness. He will teach us things through this COVID situation, that we have the choice to emerge victorious as we come out of this pandemic and as we come out of this season, or we can continue to live as victims and go, yep, Jesus let me down, the church let me down, I let me down, so I guess my Christianity is kind of,
Yeah.
You know what, Leigh-Anne, this has been fantastic. We got to go. This is our first attempt at our podcast for this kind of a conversation. Let me give you a quick word. Let me have a quick prayer, and we'll let you go. So, Father, thank you for all of our church family and those outside of our church family who are listening in today on this incredible topic and what it means to live victorious life following Jesus, even though we struggle with sadness, depression, mental health issues. Lord, I pray victory for every person. There is hope. There is the possibility to live better. And so, Father, I pray that we will take the sad moments, the depressed moments, as we learn how to take every thought captive as we're the tools we need to learn. And I pray that by the power of your Holy Spirit, you will do what we can't do for ourselves. That as we participate in taking our thoughts captive, then your Holy Spirit will do things that will set us free. And that's what I pray for, Father. Let us walk in freedom. Let us live free. In Jesus' name, amen.